the next seminar is by Professor Leslee, who is a faculty at IIT Gandhinagar, Cognitive Science Discipline. So Leslie, please share your thing and we can start.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Siddhartha, for doing this wonderful series of seminars. Thank you, Ritaban, for that wonderful talk. Charles Darwin is one of my idols as well. I did my bachelor's and master's in zoology, so I consider myself a full-blooded biologist more than a neuroscientist, or both, if there is any difference between the two. I think it's very important to engage with the history of ideas, because at least for young scientists, we will know how these ideas have come about from sometimes scant evidence, sometimes from social forces, which Ritaban also was talking about. The science doesn't happen in vacuum. So we need to sort of step back and see where these ideas came from. Are they misunderstandings? Like, for example, in the survival of fittest is very mangled by the public understanding of that idea. So the history of brain sciences, right? It's very long and complicated and has a lot of subdivisions. I want to start with some caveats and disclaimers. I'm not a historian of science. I'm a neuroscientist. And I do have some interest in the history of ideas and where certain very sticky ideas come from. Also, neuroscience, you can study from a philosophical angle, you can study from a purely biochemical angle, from an electrophysiological angle, from a psychology angle, or even computational neuroscience angle. I have not chosen one particular stream. I've just cherry-picked a lot of ideas, and I'm trying to go chronologically, but sometimes I might jump in my timeline, so don't get confused. So I thought that in order to understand the history, we will talk about 4 different ideas. Okay, the 2 ideas are already there in the title. Like, why did I say that the brain is a cooling device? Brain is not a cooling device, but that idea was popular for many thousands of years. So we will think about how that evolution of that idea came about. Why was it called a cooling device? For us, it's absurd. In the time of computers and artificial intelligence algorithm, we assume that the computer works like a computing device, right? So that is the last idea that we're going to look at. What is it computing? What is the brain computing? Where is it computing? I'm not going to go into details of it, but I'm going to show you the biological basis of this computation that happens. The other 2 ideas, I think, are very fundamental to our current understanding of how the brain works. One is the modularity principle, right? So very simply, is the brain a blob that does all the functions everywhere in this blob? Or are they subdivided into different areas, and these areas do different functions? And we will try to derive these, the history of this idea. And who talked about modularity first? Were they correct about it? Did they divide the functions properly? Did they divide the brain properly? Did they divide the kind of neurons properly? And then we'll talk about connectivity within the brain, the physical basis of connectivity. What are these things that are going to be connected? And how does that relate to modularity? And of course, how does that relate to the function of the brain? So I'm going to stick to purely these ideas, and I've ignored a lot of important ideas. Like, I'm not talking about neurotransmitters at all. I'm not talking about learning theories and computational analysis of brain functions at all, because it's just a 1-hour talk and there's so much material. So I'm going to start with a couple of bold statements here. This is the current understanding, is that all physiological functions of the body and behavior are controlled by the brain. So I kind of stand by this statement. There are certain functions that are controlled away from the brain as well. But fairly, this is true. and it was not always the case, right? The second statement here, let me see if I can get the pointer. So Dipto, do you know how to get that virtual laser pointer thingy?
It should work. I don't remember it.
Yeah,
I mean, there is a pointer somewhere.
Use the mouse, Leslie. That's fine.
That's okay. I'll use the mouse.
Yeah, the mouse is
Alright.
visible. Yeah.
It's visible. Okay.
Yes, yes, yes.
So this statement is, I would stand strongly behind it than the first statement. It's all cognitive functions. All the learning we do, all the memory, all the perception, the emotions, movement, decision making are all controlled by the brain. Okay. But we might think that this is a simple idea, but it took many years to get to this point. And sometimes you take these ideas for granted, but all ideas need to be invented. Somebody has to sit down and say, hey, this is how it's going to work. These are its components. And this is what is going to happen if we don't have these functions. So, right. So before we jump into different theories of the brain, I thought I'd give you a very small, brief primer about what the brain is. So the brain is obviously in your head. It's connected to a long spinal cord, which runs through your vertebra, your backbone. And because it has to control the whole body, it has to get information from the outside world, and it also has to give information to all the muscles, all the organs inside. So there's a network of nerves that it's connected to. It controls the body through. Okay. Grossly, there are a couple of divisions of these nerves. One is a sensory neuron, sensory nerve, which means that it's getting input from outside of the body, like what light is being perceived or what touch is being perceived. The output is, okay, I want to move the muscle, so I'm going to send information to my bicep muscle to move my arm. So that's a motor neuron. And there are some nerves that are mixed. This is pretty standard, 10 standard sort of stuff. The second thing is modularity, which means we divide the brain based on its functions and on its structure. Okay. So grossly, the front of the brain is for thinking, higher level functions, whether you want to plan something, you want to inhibit certain behaviors, it's in the front of the brain. The back of the brain is for vision. If you get damage here, you will not be able to see. Then you have the temporal lobe, which is for hearing, learning. Then you have the parietal lobe, where there is touch perception, grasping, language, and all that kind of function. There is also this cerebellum, which is called the little brain, which is important for complicated motor movements, balance, coordination. And this brainstem is important for your survival sequence, like breathing, heart rate, temperature, and things like that. So this is what I mean by modularity in a in a very gross sort of way. We'll see how this idea evolved. Just like your modular kitchen. Another anatomical feature that I want to point out here are the ventricles. So the brain is not an uniform mass. There is a little, like a small passageway which is filled with fluid. Okay, it acts like a shock absorber, and it creates its own fluid. There are certain cells that secrete the cerebrospinal fluid, which runs all through the brain and the spinal cord, and it recycles certain, it absorbs sort of excretory materials from the brain, it gives nourishment and things like this. So that is its basic functions, but we will keep coming to these ventricles and how the functions of the brain were attributed to these ventricles. Now, we know that it's a mass, but what is it made of? Like all biological tissue, it is made up of cells. And there's one cell that is the hero of the area, that's the neuron. So this is a cartoon of a neuron. And the neuron has a very distinct way it looks. It has a head, it has a long tail, and there are these hair-like features both at the tail and at the head. Okay, you would not find these cells anywhere else in the body. They're neurons, they're in the brain, spinal cord. They're the fundamental unit of computation in the brain, and they're individual entities. It took a long time for the scientists to figure out that they are individual neurons and not some kind of blob. And it also took a long time and huge amount of debate and a few Nobel Prizes to understand that these neurons are interconnected. Okay, all these neurons are interconnected. They have thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of connections in between them. So it makes a very complicated thing. And there are 85 billion neurons in the human brain. This is a cartoon, and this is a real life image. This is a fluorescent dye has been injected into the cells so that it can be visible. This is another dye where it's a silver dye. You stain very thin slices of the brain and you can see the neurons. So these are the basic sort of ideas. But let us now go back in history. Let us go back in time and figure out what was the first evidence that we know that people knew that the brain was doing something. Obviously, 6,000, 7,000 years ago, they did not have the idea of what a neuron is, what a sensory nerve. So let's start from the beginning. So archaeologists, paleontologists found these weird skulls that they unearthed. They often find skulls with massive trauma, skulls broken, leg bone shattered and things like that. And people can die of this even now, and much more in those times because there were no, modern medicine and things like that. But they noticed that the skulls were actually drilled in a very deliberate manner. This couldn't have been done by an accident. Look at this. No accident creates a pattern like this. Okay. Now the oldest were found in Peru and Spain, 6,500 BCE. And even in India, we could find these skulls in Kashmir, in the Harappan civilization sites, and even in Karnataka. Now, this is called trepanation, drilling of holes in the skull. Now, unfortunately, this idea stuck around for a long time, that even in 1800s, 1500s, this kind of trepanation was seen as a treatment for certain diseases. And this is Bosch's famous painting called The Cure of the Folly. Here is making fun of this particular, medical treatment, so to say. And there were some tribes in Namibia which had, even until the 1950s and 60s, they were following this. But the reason why I'm telling you that, because of these tribes and because of this belief that drilling holes in the skull can release some kind of spirits. And this same idea was found in these trepanated skulls that were around 8,000 years ago. This is the first evidence that human beings thought that the brain was doing something important. All right. Of course, this was a very popular idea among the counterculture, and there were a lot of these Aleister Crowley type characters who were drilling holes in their brains and saying that they were having a heightened awareness and consciousness. But I am not recommending that you drill holes in your skull. Now, the next oldest evidence comes from the papyrus that was bought by this American Egyptologist called Edwin Smith. So he used to regularly buy these papyrus from tomb writers from Egypt. And it took many years for them to translate one of these. I think there were around 15 pages. It was so well maintained. And they dated it to 30 BCE, right? Around 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. And they translate it. It took them around, only at 1930s could they translate what was written. And they figured out that it was a description of medical history of people with injuries to the head and shoulders. So this is one such example. instruction concerning a gaping wound in the head, penetrating the bone, smashing the skull, rendering open the brain of the skull. If thou examinest a man having a gaping wound in the head, penetrating to the bone, smashing a skull, rendering open brain of the skull, thou shalt palpate the wound. Okay. Then they go on to describe how to do that, and then they also describe the symptoms. Discharges blood from both his nostrils, suffers from stiffness of the neck. Diagnosis, prognosis bad, head injury, nothing can be done. This is the first time that a written evidence of the brain is known. So this is the hieroglyphic symbol for the brain. And we know that at least they know there is a brain. But what kind of functions did the Egyptians attribute to the brain? Unfortunately, they did not think very highly of the brain. They thought that the heart was the most important organ in the body and the seat of the mind and the center of all intellectual activities. In fact, when they have this practice of mummification and preserving their body of their pharaohs, they would use this scoop through the nose to dig out and drain out the brain and then pack the body up and send the person to the afterlife. And if I were that position, I would say the only thing I would need to time travel or go into afterlife is my brain. But Egyptians unfortunately did not attribute these functions to the brain. Okay. So, and now I'm going to summarize, around 500, 600 years of ideas about what the brain does. We are now moving from the people who were doing trepanation probably did not know what the brain was. Now the Egyptians know that there is a brain, they're taking it out. Now let's see what kind of functions they're attributing to it. The psyche, that is the soul, mind, and vital principle, is made up of lightest, most spherical, and fastest moving atoms. Slightly cruder atoms are connected in the heart, making it the center of emotion. Again, the heart takes precedence here. Empedocles says the blood was the medium of thought. The degree of intelligence depended on the composition of the blood. Plato, our famous, these are big names. He said reason or intellect lies in the brain. He gives that much. But then the divinest part of us, the immortal soul, the bottom soul, lies in the heart. Now, it really doesn't matter that Plato believed that perception and reason and intellect was, attributed to the brain, because he anyway did not believe that we should use our senses. He said that natural laws are subordinate to the authority of divine principle. So this idea sort of is very resilient. It stays with our interpretation of what the brain does or the body does. He always believed that there is a divine principle and whatever we have in the brain doesn't really matter. Aristotle was his pupil. Now, much more influential scientist. He was the first biologist, scientist, as people would call him now. He did a lot of experiments. And he also said the heart, which is naturally hot, must be counterbalanced in order to attain the mean, true, rational position. Thus, the brain, which is naturally cold, tempers the heat, and when the brain cools, the hot vapor reaches it. From the heart, phlegm is produced. This was their understanding of what the brain does, that it cools the hot vapor that the blood is producing. Obviously, this is wrong. Now we'll go to Hippocrates, who in his famous essay actually is very modern in his view about epilepsy being the sacred disease. Okay? He says that I do not believe that the sacred disease is any more divine or sacred than any other disease, but on the contrary has special characteristics and a definite cause. He also says it ought to be generally known that the source of our pleasure, merriment, laughter, amusement, as of our grief, pain, anxiety, tears, is nothing more than the brain. It is especially the organ that enables us to think, see, hear, distinguish the ugly and the beautiful, bad and the good, pleasant and unpleasant. It's the heart, it's the brain too, which is the seat of madness and delirium, of fear, sprite, that assigns. This is a very modern idea, right? We can say that all these things are true. He did attribute the correct functions, but when it comes to how it works, he again goes back to the phlegm and the theories of the routes for the passage of phlegm from the brain be blocked, the discharge enters blood vessels. This causes aphonia, choking, foaming at the mouth, clenching of the teeth, convulsive movements of the hand, eyes are fixed, patients become unconscious, in some cases passes it. He's talking about a seizure. Okay? All these symptoms are produced and cold phlegm discharge into the blood, which is warm, so the chilling the blood and obstructing its flow. So he's got some things partially right, which is how he describes these mental illnesses and what the brain is for, but he's completely wrong about how the brain works. Notice nobody's talking about cells, nerves, nothing like that. They're still very pre-scientific in there. Now, there's also a compromise. There's always the middle path. The Arab physician Avicenna, he says that he places the sensation, cognition, movement in the brain, and in turn he believes was controlled by the heart. And this was such a popular opinion that it's even there in our famous literature, the Arabian Nights, 1001 Arabian Nights. In the 439th night, when the Caliph Sawan asked the brilliant girl, Tawud, where is the seat of understanding? She answers, Allah casted it in the heart, where its illustrious beings ascend to the brain, and there it becomes fixed. So we have this long history of attributing heart as a center of emotions. Even we use that, our emojis use that. We use heartbreak to denote pain when pain is exclusively produced in the brain, and the heart is nothing but a pumping device. So somewhere down the evolution of this idea of what the brain does, heart gets misattributed with most of its function, and we still use it colloquially. Okay, so we're going to make another big jump, and we are now going to talk about neuroanatomy, which means what is the shape, what are the different parts of the brain. Obviously, all that was not studied in the previous times that we were talking about. The Museum of Alexandria is a special place. It was established by Ptolemy, the end of 4th century BC. Some of social and regulatory changes caused a big jump in our understanding of how the brain looks like. Right? Here they allowed for the dissection of human body, and this university, or whatever it's called, if the museum had rooms where scholars can stay, they had complete, they had stipends. It was almost like a very, a huge university with all kinds of facilities and full support from the totalitarian regime. And also the philosophical ideas about people dying sort of change. So dissection was allowed in animals, in corpse, and also vivisection was performed on criminals lodged in prison. Excuse me. Ethically problematic, but it gave rise to our first detailed, accurate description of the brain. And this is how they would draw it. This is one of the oldest images about the brain. And they say he gives the analogy, Erasistratus gives the analogy of convulsions of the intestine to the brain. And he says the larger the convolutions, the greater of intelligence. It is somewhat true. You can still use that as a heuristic even now when you look at different brains. But here again, the ventricles, which are these shock-absorbing fluid-filled sacs inside the brain, he puts all the functions, the command center of the brain to these ventricles. Okay, and then we again jump to the next great medical practitioner, neuroscientist. He discovered a lot of anatomical, morphological functions in the body. So he provided a detailed account of the anatomy of the brain. He viewed sensation as a central process. He divided the brain and attributed different functions to different parts. Most of them are incorrect in our current understanding, but at least he divided them into different parts and he gave different functions. Of course, he had the luxury of dissecting on a lot of gladiators who die in the process of doing whatever they did. And Galen, one of the most genius experiment that he performed was on a pig that he tied down in a rack and he could trace each of those nerves that are coming out of the brain. In one public demonstration, he would keep cutting different nerves, and he would pause between cutting the pharyngeal nerve, which controls the sound production through our larynx, and he would cut that nerve, and immediately that pig that was screaming would go silent. And the entire audience these days, in those days, the dissection was done in a huge amphitheater with hundreds of people watching, and he was able to prove that there are certain nerves that are giving output, the motor nerves, and there are certain nerves that are getting input, that is the sensory nerve. So this was a very big, startling discovery. However, when it again comes to where the functions are located in the brain, right, and what is the driving force, he would again fall back to the old ideas of psychic pneuma, the animal spirits, which are the active principles both in his sensory and the motor nerve of the brain. And so this is his whole diagram of how behavior is, comes about. There's animal spirit, there's natural spirit, there's vital spirit. There is heart, which is huge, is drawn huge here. The brain is actually given only a smaller space, and the liver also is given a lot of importance. But Galen was very, very influential. Even when he was talking about subdivision of the brain, you see how the ventricles, which are the fluid-filled spaces, sort of divides them into three and says one is for memory, one is for executive function, one is for other sensation and things like that. So he was a very good anatomist. He would dissect and draw out things in detail. But when it comes to functions, we were still groping in the dark. We would not know where to attribute all these functions at. Then comes the Renaissance area, and we have this Andreas Vesalius of Padua, the greatest anatomist, and he refines the art of anatomy. And you can see his drawings now. This is how the brain looks like. Okay, you can actually say that these are the nerves that are coming out. And he really pushed the game up, and he absolutely hated Galen. And Galen at that time, if you have to say something contradictory to the last 1,500 years of history, you really have to get your theories right. And he was very aggressive and bold in saying Aristotle was wrong. Okay, Plato was wrong. Galen was wrong. All these guys that we all studied in the textbook of 1,000 years, you're all wrong. And the reason why he was able to do was he had these brilliant skills in neuroanatomy. This was also the time of Da Vinci. Da Vinci also had a lot of theories about how the brain works. And if you notice in his diagrams, you see the ventricles, they're huge. They might have got their neuroanatomy well, but they still have this problematic understanding of spirits. Things have to be cooling. At least the idea of cooling had slowly died away, but there was still this idea of animal spirits. All that, there is a soul, and the soul resides in the. Soul is an amorphous thing. It's not something that can be reduced to a material. So they were looking for spaces with gas and spirit inside, and this empty chamber here, which Vesalius describes here correctly, that seems to be the substrate for them, where all these magical functions happen, like memory and perception and things like that. So the next person is perhaps one small thing I want to point out in the previous thing is when Vesalius published his book on neuroanatomy. That was the same year Copernicus published his book on the heliosynthesis. So that sort of marks a division between your, ancient history to modern history and the whole scientific birth of the scientific revolution. But when we come back to neuroscience, perhaps the most important neuroscientist and the most important philosopher whose ideas still resonate with modern neuroscience is Descartes. Okay. Now, Descartes was the one who said, look, there's nothing like this whole psyche, soul, life force into your brain. It's all material. It's all in the brain. He went too far. He said everything is automata because he studied the reflexes. And the reflex, you know, is really fast. You know, if somebody is going touching the fire, you're going to immediately retract your hand. So he was the first person to study these reflexes as a, you know, a proper biological phenomena that needs to be investigated. He also studied perception, and he had this correct understanding that there's something that's coming into the eye, and then that's creating the image in your brain. You notice the brain is really small. His anatomy was not really great, but his concepts were right. In fact, he said that these animal spirits are nothing but they're a special class of volatile chemical particle. No, it's very prescient of him because he's talking about the neurotransmitters. He didn't have the words for it. And this is an image of the fountain in Versailles. And he said, your brain is working like a fountain. There's all these pulleys and levers. You press the button here, the water comes out there. And this was the biggest technological advance at that time. And he used that analogy to explain how the brain works. Now, this is also the time when William Harvey's idea of heart as a pump is also coming about. So the importance of heart is going down and the brain is being increased. Now, we need to talk a little bit about his, who he was. He was a French guy who really did not like living in France, so he always lived in Holland. And he was Catholic, and Holland was a Protestant country. So there was always the tension that he had that he was a minority and he was persecuted, not directly, but he was always mindful that things can go bad. So when he wanted to publish his book about this, that is when Galileo also was getting into trouble. So he delayed the publication of that book. And in fact, when he died in Holland, when they buried him, they didn't even give him a proper burial ground. He was buried in a burial ground for orphans. And he finally got a job. I mean, he always had a job. He was doing well professionally, but he was always careful and tempering his ideas a little bit. And one of that is called the dualism. So he says that, look, everything has an material form. So what about the mind? The church is getting a little bit more worried than the previous years because a lot of all the mysteries that they were explaining are being explained by scientists, and they don't have a lot of control over the population. So it was one of those forces that led him to come up with this dualism. So he said that the physical substances are material extended in space, but includes particles that can be observed and measured. But mental substances cannot be examined, for they do not have any material basis of fixed location in space. So here's your mind-body separation. So when he separated these two things, that kind of stuck with us even now. When we say that there's a devil is possessing for epilepsy, for Huntington's disease, people were burnt at the stakes, calling them witches and things like that. And he also put the pineal gland in the center of the brain as the seat of consciousness. This is his idea of the brain. The anatomy part is wrong. However, the whole idea of studying reflexes and also talking about the material basis of the brain was so very influential for our modern theories. So now I want to talk a little bit about modularity. I told you that modularity is nothing but dividing the brain into different parts and then attributing different functions to it. There's a right way of doing it, and then there's a bad way of doing it. The bad way of doing it is something called phrenology. Okay? It was started by Gall and Spozane, and they also attributed different brain regions to different functions. So what is wrong? They thought that they can actually feel the bumps of the brain, and that reflects how the brain is inside the skull. That's completely untrue, but they believed in it. So they would bring some people and they would touch their brain And this gentleman, if they thought that 32 was a little bulgy, they will immediately go down in their list, and 32 is cautiousness. They'll say this man is a cautious person because his brain is protruding that way. And then the skull is shown. Totally wrong. The second thing is they had a very gross, almost, idiosyncratic way of dividing these functions. Like if you take a look at this, 17 is suavity. There's an area in the brain for you to be suave. I don't understand it. There is mirthfulness. There is spirituality. There is order. There is destructiveness. So these were the two drawbacks of what functions they chose and how that they can touch the skull and figure out. Now, unfortunately, this idea was very popular. And just like Ritoben was saying, people were using this for negative, for evil purposes, like the basis of racism. They would classify different races because of their skull and say, look, this person is bad because their skull is shaped that way. But we know there is natural variation. To be fair, Gall did not have that idea. He was not a racist. He believed that everybody should be educated. And he thought that if somebody has a skull that is, which is problematic, you should give them extra training and bring them up to the level of the other people. Now, this is a wrong, bad idea in terms of touching skulls, but the idea of dividing brain functions, right, into finer and finer elements, the granularity started with these guys, and also locating it to one area. So the proper modern neuroscience study started with this Frenchman called Paul Broca. He had a patient whom he codenamed Tan, because this is how Tan would speak. Monday, Dad, Peter, Tan, Dad, hospital, Wednesday, 9 o'clock, oh, Thursday, 10 o'clock, doctors. So this man is trying to say that he needs to go to the doctor on Wednesday, but there is no fluent speech happening. All right. You contrast that. So obviously, when the person was alive, they didn't have the technology to see how the brain was. But Broca bet that there will be a lesion, or there will be an injury or a lack in the part of the brain. And when they dissected out the brain after Tan died, this was the damage that was done. And this is this area called Broca. Now, at the same time, there was a German neurologist who was studying another patient who was so fluent in speech, but lacked completely in content or meaning, complete nonsense speech. Now, this area is slightly behind. Okay. Now, these are proper localization of functions on the brain. You compare this to the functions of, the functions that were attributed by the phrenologists, and you compare to what these guys are attributing. So here you say that both these Wernicke's area and Broca's area, which are named after these two gentlemen, are involved in speech production and generating the meaning of what you speak. So here we are talking about two different areas and also connections. All right. So we've come a long way in terms of what the brain does. Nobody's talking about the heart anymore. We know exactly how the brain looks, and we're also talking about smaller and smaller areas. Now, this method of looking at people with brain injuries and studying their lack of function in detail is done even now. It's super powerful. One of the most famous patients is Henry Molaison, who passed away in 2008. When he was 25 years old, he had a lot of intractable epilepsy. And so the doctors removed two parts of the brain which they thought was completely useless. And he was having, two attacks of epilepsy every day. He couldn't keep his job down. So they do a cost-benefit analysis and you say, okay, let's remove this area where they found that the epileptic seizures arise from. And let's see what functions the person will lack in. Now, it turns out they pulled out this area called the hippocampus. It looks like the seahorse, so it's called the hippocampus. Turns out it was important for formation of new memory. So from that day of operation, HM did not have any new memories formed. he could not figure out, who his doctor was, who the president was. He just could not form new memories. So from then on, we came to understand that hippocampus is important for formation of new memories. And it's similar to what happens in these movies. I've not seen Gajini, but I've seen the original from which they copied it from, Memento. This person has an anterograde amnesia. So it is really, it's a really good movie, and you can watch to understand how, it's kind of similar to what HM must have gone through. Now, we also have new ways of looking at the brain. And this is fMRI. This is from an fMRI where all these yellow blobs are activations, which means those are the areas that are being activated when you're using, when you're performing certain functions. So this graph is from a famous study of London taxi drivers who were supposed to memorize all the streets and all the directions in London. And so because they are used to do this wayfinding a lot, the hippocampus, which codes for memory, is actually larger. So as the years of experience in taxi driving increases, so does the volume of the hippocampus. Now, even more fine-grained modularity. 1983, a patient lost the ability to see objects in motion following a stroke. So this is how somebody would experience watching a dance. They would just not be able to perceive movement at all. What that means is that there's a particular area in the brain that is coding for movement in vision, right? And there's another disease where the person loses the ability to recognize faces only. They're able to see everything. They can recognize cups and everything, but they just can't see faces. What that means is that there is a particular area that is required for perceiving faces and also objects that are of their expertise. If they're a bird watcher, it's birds and things like this. The Oliver Sacks wrote a very famous book about it. So now, from that gross modularity of sense of humor, mirthfulness in the skull, we've come to these really fine-grained places and fine also division of functions. Now, the current understanding is that there are multiple areas in the brain which are coding for larger behavior. So the brain sort of breaks down this large task into small bits, and these parts are primarily involved in processing that. This is a flattened map of the brain, and each color indicates a different part, and it's only for the visual function. There are about 40-45 areas just for us to perceive different visual sensations. Now, I want to have a little bit of a caveat here. Just because they're being put in a localized place does not mean they're not interconnected. They don't work in isolation. All right, they work in conjunction with a lot of other places, and here you're connected through networks. These neurons in these different parts of the brain, although they're modular, they don't work by themselves. They always work in conjunction with others. And now we've talked about the cooling device, now the modularity. Let's talk a little bit about interconnectivity. Now, if we have to talk about interconnectivity, the question is, what are we connecting inside the brain? What is the brain made of? We'll have to go back in time now to see who was the first person to look at the brain tissue in the microscope. It was Professor Marcello Malfighi. Malfighian tubules were named after him. So he discovered capillaries, he discovered a whole bunch of things. He also was the first person to cut the cortex and look under the microscope. But this is how he drew the cortex as. He said they were like globules. They were almost like glands, and they were ducts connected. This also goes back to the idea of the brain being the cooling device. But I was totally wrong. Around 200 years later, this is the first ever diagram of a neuron. It was drawn by Valentin, who was a student of a very famous man called Jan Potpunji, who was a Polish, if I'm not mistaken, he's a Polish neuroanatomist who actually was able to draw neurons like this. And he was also saying that, look, there are different areas in the brain That's because there are different kinds of neurons in it. So he's now drawing some thin kind of neurons here. So this is a different part of the brain. This is a different part of the brain. And this is the different part. So although the phrenologists broke down the brain into different parts, the subsequent people also, even the earlier part, when you think about the ventricles, also have different functions. He was the first one to show that, look, it's because they have different neurons, right? That these parts of the brain are looking different under the microscope, and they might subserve different functions. And this is immediately after your cell theory and Hooke discovering the microscope and looking at the thin slice of cork under the microscope. So after that revolution, you get this the first ideas about neurons in the brain. And then it comes to these two gentlemen who kind of revolutionized the way we look at neurons. One was this Italian named Emilio Golgi. He discovers a dye through which you can stain these neurons and see even the finer details. If you notice in the first diagram when I showed you, there were hair-like structures on the end of the neurons. But look at Purkinje's diagram or even Valentine's diagram. They really could not see these thin fibers that were coming out, right? So they thought this is what the neuron was. When the Golgi stain was discovered, they could really map out these neurons in absolutely gorgeous detail. Even before that, people were, if you look at the history in the last, in those 200 years, first it will, the neuron will be a very stubby thing. And then slowly the number of the hair-like fibers called dendrites and axons sort of increase as the technology of microscopy and dyeing increases. The father of modern neuroscience and cell-based theory is Cajal, who uses Golgi's method, and he actually came out with the correct interpretation for what they saw under the microscope. So when you're looking into the microscope, there are these hundreds of cells, there are all these wiry mess around it. So Golgi believed that these cells are individual and that they are connected to each other. He just thought that they are an interconnected mass, like a reticulum. So he called it the reticular theory. But Cajal, one of the stroke of genius or luck he had was that even though he was using Golgi's stain, he used immature animals, very young animals, which did not have a myelin chain. This is something for the technical people, that the stain actually does not work so well if the cell is completely myelinated. Okay, so if you take an adult mice and you look at the, say, pyramidal cell, you will not have that exuberant dendrites because the myelin is not going to pick up the dye. But then in an immature animal, you are able to see all the glorious detail. So he was able to see more, and he was able to say that neurons are independent entities. We're coming back to what we saw in the first slide. Okay, first time in history is, we're correct that the neurons are independent entities. They all have these fiber-like things that connect to different neurons, and they exchange some information for sending signals from one to the other. But this is the neuron theory, that these cells are independent. Even this simple idea was quite a struggle for many hundreds of years ago. In fact, Golgi and Cajal did not get along well at all. They both got the Nobel Prize at the same year, and during the Nobel Prize acceptance speech also, Golgi was attacking Cajal, saying he's wrong, and apparently they went to the train together and did not speak to each other. So these, when I said absolutely gorgeous images, I really didn't mean it. These are some of the drawings of, this is Golgi's drawing, I think this is Cajal's drawing, and they are exquisite. Okay, now we have come till we talked about the modularity, we're talking about the interconnections. We know that they're interconnected, but how do we make them work? How do we say that these interconnections are what are responsible for certain behavior? So that idea, the responsibility to explain it to us falls upon Charles Sherrington, who, like Descartes, started studying the reflex system. So he started systematically studying the spinal cord and seeing, okay, if I give this stimuli, say if I do a pinprick on the dog's leg, it's going to retract, right? What are the muscles that are needed? What are the neurons that are needed to do this very simple behavior, right? So he said that, so this is your circuit for a simple reflex. So this is a sensory neuron that's going to take in the information and it's going to send an information through this motor neuron to say, pull back this. So simple connection, he established that these neurons are connected to each other and that these reflexes are happening because of this circuit. Descartes also studied it, but he didn't say it was because of neurons or reflex. He said that it's because of, psychic spirit that goes in and comes out. So now you're able to explain certain behavior through neurons. Now, this might be a simple reflex, but if you abstract it, now Sherrington believed that you integrate these multiple reflex activity at multiple levels, and you can explain these complex behaviors. And he also came up with the idea of a synapse. A synapse is here. A connection between one neuron to another is called the synapse. It's a very, very powerful concept. And it's not, to him, it was just a concept. Okay. He did not have the microscopy until 1950s, when electron microscopy was there, when people could look exactly between two neurons to see the synapse. It was still an abstract concept, just like Prithovan was talking about. Genes were an abstract concept, and only when Mendel discovered it, it was only an abstract concept, right? Much later, we know that there is a physical entity called the gene coded in the DNA. Similarly, as powerful a concept, a synapse between two neurons, is where this decision making happens, whether to retract the leg or not. So this is a recreation of a synapse between two neurons. Now we know that if this neuron is communicating and sending a signal to another. If you look into the neuron, there are a lot of these little dots with these neurotransmitters. It could be dopamine, serotonin. It goes and attaches itself to the receptor here, and then information is transmitted from one cell to another. Sherrington obviously did not know about it, but the concept started from here. All right. Now, we need to talk a little bit about the interconnectivity. Right? We're talking about one cell in the spinal cord. Now, after Sherrington, Pavlov was talking about conditioned reflexes. He said, look, the dog is able to salivate, right? And it's able to associate a ringing of the bell to the salivation. And if you pair these two stimuli often enough, just ringing the bell, the dog will salivate. So the first reflex of salivation is being conditioned, all right? So, and then came the Skinner. Skinner talked about even higher level ideas. He completely believed that all higher level functions like language, emotion, everything can be learned through this conditioning of reflexes. So you take Sherrington's idea, right? And then you build complexity to it, and then you can actually explain all biological functions, all behavior, all adaptive functions, and you're trying to explain it through the connections in the neurons. And Leslee and many neuroscientists after that are looking for these connections in the brain, looking for these signatures of connections in the brain, and they cannot find it. One of the reasons that they cannot find it is that not all functions are conditioned reflexes. These functions are not as simple as the reflexes, and so they are not going to be represented in one particular synapse. Okay, one of Lashlee's experiment was he would take the rat and he would remove a small piece of the brain, and then he will write down what function it loses. Maybe it loses its directionality, maybe it loses its sense of smell, maybe it loses its sense of vision. Now, as and when he took more and more and more, he was expecting that the number of functions that it's losing will keep increasing. But that didn't happen. It plateaued at some time and paradoxically even increased. So he was really confused about where do we look for these connections? How are these information coded in the brain? So The answer to it came from a theoretician called Donald Hebb, and he made certain slight modifications in how we talk about these connections between the neurons. He said, look, let's just not look at something that is linear like a Sherrington's idea. Let's make it into a loop. Okay, memory could be stored in a loop of these neurons. Now each color would be the neuron's body, and this arrow would be the directionality of the connection to the next neuron. So he made these circular neuronal models, large number of neurons in the network. Then he also said that if these two neurons are going to be activated together, then the strength between the two is going to be increased. So that's what the famous dictum is: neurons that fire together, wire together. And he also said the synapse will get strengthened if there is activity in both synapses at the same time, which is what the neuron that fire together, wire together. So now we are talking about synapse as a unit that can increase or decrease in strength. All right. This is where the memory of whatever that's happened before is stored. So this is the computational unit for the brain. And all ideas about how we are modeling brain as a computational unit is because of this changing of weights in these synapses, which are part of these large networks. And that is the substrate for all functioning of the brain. And so now, just like the Human Genome Project, we had the Brain Project, and now we have the Human Connectome Project, where we want to map out the connections of different modules in the brain and how they change with age, with different functions, with different diseases and things like that. So now when we look back at this diagram, it makes sense that there is modularity, that there are these small dots that they represent a particular function. And there is also a grosser anatomy of red color around the parietal area and the green at the visual area. But they're also highly interconnected. And even diseases, you can look at them as diseases of connectivity. Okay, these are different representations of changes in connections that are happening because of Alzheimer's. So I hope I've given, a kind of an overview of what the current understanding of how we are looking at functions are, which is a modularity with different connectivity. And I think we also talked about how we are calling the brain as a computing device, and also these old ideas of brain being a cooling device. And with that, I want to end, and we have